Are GABA or methylation support useful for panic attacks? Hi, I'm Chris Masterjohn, and I have a PhD in nutritional sciences. I am not a medical doctor, and nothing contained in this episode may be construed as medical or nutritional advice of any kind, or a substitute therefore. This episode is meant purely as scientific education. If you wish to act on any ideas presented in this episode, please consult your physician first, and never take anything herein as a reason to contradict medical advice. With that said, enjoy the episode.
Folly says, I'm wondering your thoughts about Ltheanine and or GABA for acute anxiety panic. Patient is followed by psych already, but I'm wanting a deeper dive into the nutrition approach. Patient is an adolescent, fairly poor eater on an SSRI already. I don't know that much about Ltheanine. I haven't studied it. My understanding is it does a number of things in the brain, and in part, it helps promote GABA activity. I don't remember I haven't studied the mechanisms in any detail, so it's not top of mind for me. Yeah, I think anything that increases GABA activity is probably going to slow down anxiety and panic. I think that's clear just from the drugs that are used to treat anxiety and panic disorder. So Xanax is used for that purpose. I will say that I think, and so if you go into the Chris Masterjohn Light section, I have a bunch of videos about GABA that include getting GABA from food, that include the nutrients that you need to make GABA, that include some of the nutrients needed for proper GABA activity. And there's a lot of them, so I won't rehash all those here. But I'll just add a few things. So I do think that working on nutritional support around GABA makes sense, but I also would look at histamine, because histamine is an alertness signal, but I think in very excessive amounts, histamine is a panic signal. And there's an interesting, this is sort of at the level of anecdote, or I guess it's case series, but there was an allergy clinic that was treating people with a histamine-free diet for eczema, and it didn't really work for the eczema, but they noted that I think 3 of the patients had panic attacks, and the panic attacks totally disappeared on the histamine-free diet. I'm not suggesting a histamine-free diet is the thing to use to treat panic attacks, but I think it supports the idea that histamine plays a role in panic attack. And I believe histamine also plays a role in generalized anxiety, and that's supported by the use of certain classes of antihistamines in generalized anxiety disorder, and there are studies on that. And then I think another thing that's underappreciated is the role of mental flexibility in anxiety and depression. And so one of the things that I've covered, and I covered this in the greatest detail in a long-form podcast called Methylate Your Way to Mental Health with Dopamine. And you can just Google that if you want the website version, and then search within Mastering Nutrition under My Products if you're in the Master Pass, because you have the transcript ready there. And the basic thrust of that framework is that dopamine is one of the controllers of the relative balance between mental rigidity and mental flexibility. And generally speaking, methylation of dopamine produces a more mentally flexible phenotype, and less methylation of dopamine produces a more rigid mental phenotype. And so I don't think that, you want a balance between these, right? Because if you have too much flexibility, then you can't focus on anything. You are easily distracted. You are impulsive, and you can't focus. Whereas on the flip side, if you have too much mental rigidity, you are endlessly ruminating and you cannot unstick your mind from things that are causing harm to your mind. And so, I had a real interesting consulting client once who was an entrepreneur, and he was trying to manipulate his focus using nootropics, fasting, supplements, methylation supplements, etc. And he was trying to extend the amount of hyper focus that he had so that he could work better at his business. And what was interesting was by the time that he talked to me, he had already figured out, and I think I tell his story under a pseudonym in Methylate Your Rate of Mental Health. But by the time that he became my client, he had basically designed for himself a protocol that involved fasting and a handful of supplements that were basically all serving to put him in a low methylation state. And this was dramatically extending his period of focus. The problem was that as part of the collateral damage, he would, a few days a month get a panic attack. And so why did that happen? Well, because ruminating isn't necessarily bad if you have enough flexibility, or just your predisposition is to constantly put you in a place where the thing you're ruminating on is the thing that makes you money. But if your general predispositions, because of how you think about the world, how you, what your emotional patterns are, what the context is, if you're surrounded by people that cause you emotional stress, or cause you to take on a negative outlook, or if you just, you're suffering from financial stress or something that's increasing your anxiety level, whatever it is, if the mix of inputs of, other inputs besides mental flexibility and rigidity, if the mix of inputs into that is biased towards things that are anxiety provoking, then you will ruminate on the anxiety producing thought, and the anxiety producing thought pattern or emotional pattern will have dramatically more power. And there's experimental evidence consistent with this. For example, in people who have low COMT activity, which is COMT, catechol-methyltransferase, is the enzyme that methylates dopamine. And people who, for genetic reasons, have low COMT activity, when you show them pictures of a picture with a negative emotional tone, they are far more likely to develop an emotional response to it than someone with high COMT activity. And within that low methylation phenotype, there are some people who have a greater prefrontal cortex reaction to that, and they, within the low methylation phenotype, are the ones who don't develop the emotional reaction, as judged by their subjective reaction as well as the amygdala lighting up. And so what that shows is basically that the people with high methylation of dopamine, they don't get bothered by the picture because they're like, I don't like that picture. Whoosh, I forgot it already. People with low methylation of dopamine, they see the picture and they're like, can't stop thinking about the picture. But within that group, the people who have high executive function are going to be like, I can't get this out of my head, but I'm going to do something about it and ignore it. They with their executive function, they intervene and override the fact that this picture's stuck in their mind and is trying to light up their emotional centers. I painted that picture a little aggressive, but it could have been somebody's very practiced from a meditation perspective or whatever, to be able to intervene in that cycle and put it to a stop. And so I think you have to consider methylation from the perspective of creating, low methylation creates more rumination, less mental flexibility, which then means that if you have anxiety producing inputs, those anxiety producing inputs have more power. So low methylation doesn't cause anxiety. It just gives the things that cause anxiety more power. Whereas histamine is very much a, there's at low levels of histamine, this is your knocked out zone. That's why Benadryl makes you sleepy. At these levels of histamine, this is your alert zone. Everything's great. At these levels of histamine, this is your generalized anxiety disorder level. And then at these levels of histamine, this is your I'm having a panic attack level, right? So histamine, I think, is just above a certain threshold, is just a pro-anxiety molecule. And then GABA, I feel like GABA's interesting because I honestly think that, probably what's happening when you take a Xanax is it's just sort of like shutting down the neural activity that's produced, kind of resulting from the anxiety level, whether it's histamine or whatever else. However, it is also true that GABA does play a role in helping dopamine find new things to motivate the brain to focus on. And so I think that's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that, I don't know if double-edged sword is the right word, but generally when you have deficient GABA activity, I think you're going to be more distracted and less focused because dopamine is trying to pay your attention on one thing and it relies on GABA to shut off your attention to everything else. But it's also the case that you need a dopamine spike to a new thing to take your mind off one thing and put it on the other thing. And so I think GABA function might help in that particular scenario where you're actively trying to move your focus from one thing to another, and inside basal ganglia, having access to GABA activity there may help dopamine move your attention across those things. So to sum that up, look at Chris Masterjohn Light GABA videos and transcripts. There's many of them. And then same thing, Chris Masterjohn Light videos and transcripts on histamine. There are, there's like 7 of them. And then Methylate Your Way to Mental Health on dopamine, on covering the methylation aspects, where GABA is calming. GABA might help move focus from one thing to another. Methylating dopamine is needed to provide mental flexibility so you don't get stuck on anxiety-producing thought patterns and emotional patterns. And histamine it's a general stimulant of anxiety beyond a certain threshold. So I think those would be the key areas to focus on. Hope that helps. Thank you, Sheffley, for your question.
This episode was part of a Q&A for members of the CMJ Masterpass, a buyer's club with exclusive and massive discounts on your favorite premium foods and health products, including pasture-raised and wild meat and seafood, supplements, sleep accessories, water filters, phototherapy devices, and much more. As a bonus, you also get to participate in monthly private Zoom Q&As with me. You can join the Masterpass at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass and use the code Q&A, spelled out as Q-A-N-D-A, Q&A, for a 10% lifetime discount. For the remainder of 2020, I will be working full-time on finishing my Vitamins and Minerals 101 book while reserving a portion of my time for consulting clients. You can pre-order my book at chrismasterjohnphd.com/book. In my consulting, I am neither a medical practitioner nor a coach. I serve as your data analyst and your strategist. I teach you scientific principles of health and wellness, help you analyze your data, and help brainstorm actionable strategies. You can sign up for a consultation at chrismasterjohnphd.com/consultations. I will try to respond to comments here when I can, but my presence will be intermittent while I'm finishing my book. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next episode.